By 1:30 in the morning, Harbor Point Medical Center had gone strangely quiet, the way hospitals sometimes do after a crisis so sharp and public that even the building seemed to recoil from it. The machines still spoke in their thin mechanical languages, monitors pulsing, infusion pumps ticking, ventilators exhaling with patient precision, but the people moved with the hush that follows shock. Rain slipped down the windows in silver threads and blurred the city lights into a wash of pale gold and white. Down in the atrium, the donor banners from the canceled gala still hung in bright, expensive folds above polished floors, untouched by the night's chaos and therefore made faintly absurd by it. On the upper floors, the ordinary work of medicine continued under fluorescent light and fatigue, but in one narrow corridor outside an old rehabilitation wing, a kind of suspended judgment had settled over everything. Lena Hart sat alone at a station that felt more like a witness stand than a desk. 3 unfinished charts lay open before her, their boxes and timestamps precise in a way human memory rarely was. Beside them sat a paper cup of coffee gone cold long enough to grow a thin skin across the surface. She had not touched it in almost an hour. Her shoulders ached. The base of her neck was tight. The adrenaline that had carried her through the emergency had begun to thin, leaving behind a clean, hard exhaustion that felt older than the shift itself. Somewhere above and behind the fatigue lived a quieter knowledge. The hospital had not yet decided whether what she had done would be treated as courage or misconduct. For the moment, she remained in the uneasy space between those two judgments, charting carefully while others told themselves that procedure would sort out what conscience had failed to catch in time. Rosa Delgado came down the corridor without hurry and eased herself into the chair beside Lena. She did not begin with comfort. She studied Lena's face the way experienced nurses study complicated wounds, not for drama but for truth. The events in the trauma bay had left marks that were not visible in the charting system. Lena had held pressure, moved with certainty, called the physiology before the scan confirmed it, and acted in the narrow window between warning and collapse. Rosa had worked long enough to know the difference between luck, skill, and experience of a kind most hospitals never officially account for. The look on Commander Gabriel Cade's face earlier in the night had not been casual recognition, nor had the patient's insistence on seeing Lena once he woke. There was history here, and not the ordinary kind. Rosa asked the question directly because she was not a woman who believed much good came from circling truth once the room had already felt it. She wanted to know who Lena really was. Lena, still looking at the chart in front of her, gave the smallest answer possible and described herself as a tired nurse. It was technically true and clearly insufficient. Rosa pressed, not out of curiosity for gossip, but because she understood institutions. When a place like Harbor Point sensed an imbalance between official titles and actual competence, it rarely handled that imbalance gracefully. Lena's restraint, her timing, and the way she had read the patient under pressure had come from somewhere deeper than routine floor experience. Rosa wanted to hear Lena name it. Lena refused, not sharply, but with the practiced economy of someone who had spent years declining to explain herself to rooms that had not earned the story. When Rosa realized she would not get the answer that way, she shifted to the more immediate problem. She told Lena what mattered now. A case was being assembled, and it was not against the physician who had missed the warning signs. It was against the nurse who had acted after being ignored. Celia Morton was already using the language of scope and protocol. Adrian Vale had begun shaping the story into one of unauthorized intervention and dangerous impulsiveness. The machine of institutional self-protection was warming up. Lena did not look surprised. Her faint smile suggested she had anticipated the pattern from the moment the crisis stabilized. Rosa, who had reviewed the timestamps and spoken quietly with others who had been present, told her that she had not been alone in what she saw. Priya had heard the warning. Malik had heard it. The paramedic had heard it. The chart supported it. If administration tried to isolate Lena, they would not be able to do so cleanly. That promise landed more deeply than either woman made visible. Lena finally looked up, and some of the guardedness in her face gave way to something more human and vulnerable. She thanked Rosa in a voice so quiet it almost dissolved into the hum of the lights. Rosa squeezed her shoulder once and left her there with the unfinished documentation, the cold coffee, and the long corridor that now felt like the front edge of a coming storm. Lena returned to her charting, but only in the way people return to routine when they know routine has become a thin disguise for waiting. She recorded what had happened with careful clarity. She did not embellish. She did not protect anyone. She did not attempt to defend herself in the notes. She wrote the timeline as she had lived it, warning, dismissal, decline, collapse, intervention, stabilization. 10 minutes later, the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hall. Commander Gabriel Cade stepped out alone. He had removed the field jacket he had arrived in, but the stripped-down version of him remained no less formidable. Some men carried authority because institutions dressed them in it. Others carried it as if authority were simply the natural consequence of surviving responsibility without surrendering to ego. Cade belonged to the second kind. The corridor changed subtly when he entered it. Not because he demanded attention, but because stillness itself rearranged around him. He walked toward Lena's desk with the measured pace of someone who had spent much of his life entering rooms where every movement mattered. He stopped a few feet away and told her that Mason Reed wanted to see her. Lena answered with the only rule presently between her and the ICU. She had been instructed not to have informal access to the patient. Cade's response held no surprise. He noted with dry precision how convenient that instruction was for the people hoping morning might arrive before the truth did. Lena closed the chart in front of her and stood. She asked, equally dry, convenient for whom? Cade did not need to answer directly. Both of them understood. They began walking toward the ICU observation unit together, their footsteps muted by polished floors and a late-night quiet heavy with withheld conclusions. Down another corridor, a monitor alarm sounded and then stopped. Somewhere a cart rolled across a seam in the tile. Harbor Point continued doing what hospitals always do, creating the appearance of order while actual human survival depended on skill, timing, and whoever cared enough to notice the right thing soon enough. At the doorway to Reed's room, Cade paused and spoke without looking at her. He told Lena that she had vanished. She answered that she had resigned. He corrected the word and said she had disappeared. She said she had wanted a quieter life. Only then did he glance at her, and the look carried the faintest edge of old knowledge. He remarked that she had chosen the wrong hospital for quiet. The statement was so dry it might have been humor in another setting. Here it was simply true. Then he stepped aside and let her enter the room where the most politically valuable patient in the building had nearly died under the care of people more committed to hierarchy than reassessment. Colonel Mason Reed was propped up in bed with oxygen resting at his nose and a chest tube functioning properly at his side. His face remained pale and drawn, but he was unmistakably awake. Exhaustion had not diminished the alertness in his eyes. When he saw Lena, the sternness around his mouth loosened. Relief altered his whole expression. She crossed to the bedside and, out of pure reflex more than intention, checked his monitor before anything else. It was habit, and habit told more truth than most introductions ever could. Reed observed her with the careful attention of someone comparing the present to a memory he had not expected to revisit. He was in pain, irritable, alive, and increasingly certain that the rhythm of her thinking belonged to someone he had once trusted under conditions far more brutal than Harbor Point's controlled lighting and laminated protocols. Recognition moved between them gradually and then all at once. Reed admitted that at first he had not known her by sight. Time had done what time always does, sanding edges, changing hair, teaching restraint to the face. But the way she had spoken in the trauma bay, the way she had called for ventilation, named the pressure issue, and read the decline before the scan made him think of a pattern he had once depended on with his life. When Cade had spoken her old call sign aloud, the uncertainty disappeared. Lena acknowledged that those years lay far behind her, though the softness in her voice suggested that distance and silence were not the same thing. Reed answered with quiet conviction that whatever years lay between then and now, it was still that experience that had kept him alive tonight. Lena adjusted the blanket near the bedrail and urged him toward rest, but Reed had no intention of sleeping through the shape of what was coming. He had spent enough of his life inside systems, military and otherwise, to understand how quickly image rushed in to protect itself when competence embarrassed authority. By dawn, he said in effect, the hospital would have to decide whether it valued being right or appearing orderly. He had seen organizations choose appearance before. He had seen what it cost. He was not prepared to lie still and let Harbor Point tidy the narrative until the nurse who acted became the problem and the physician who failed to act became the guardian of process. He had been rescued too many times by the quiet competence of people omitted from official glory to help bury one of them now. The room changed before he could say more. Adrian Vale entered with Supervisor Celia Morton and a legal officer just behind them. Vale stopped short when he saw Lena at the bedside. Annoyance flashed into anger so quickly it revealed how threatened he already felt. He reminded Lena that she had been instructed not to involve herself in the patient's care. Reed turned his head and cut through the implication immediately by making clear that he had requested her presence. Vale barely acknowledged that. His objection was no longer really about patient boundaries. It was about control. He labeled the situation inappropriate because the alternative word, inconvenient, would have said too much. Cade, still near the door, supplied that truth for him. Celia moved in fast, invoking process and review as if procedure were a neutral force rather than a tool presently being arranged. Reed's patience for euphemism was limited, especially while a chest tube still reminded him exactly how close the room had come to killing him through delay. He observed with devastating calm that a cleaner process would have involved listening to the nurse before his lung collapsed. Nobody rushed to answer that. Vale attempted to retreat onto the familiar terrain of controlled authority, professional hierarchy, and the dangers of improvisation in emergency medicine. He framed the crisis as a matter of maintaining structure under pressure. Lena finally turned toward him and answered with the truth stripped clean of institutional padding. What she had done had not been improvisation. It had been a life-saving intervention after repeated warnings were ignored. Vale countered with titles, with the fact that she was not a physician. Lena met that without visible heat and pointed to the actual failure. He had not been paying attention. The room went still because everyone present understood that the sentence struck deeper than an argument over scope. It named the central breach. Medicine does not fail only when knowledge is absent. It fails when ego interrupts perception. The legal officer lowered his eyes to the folder in his hand. Celia inhaled sharply. Vale's face tightened into the brittle anger of a man who senses his authority losing moral cover. He accused Lena, in essence, of disrespecting structure. She answered that what she could not respect was avoidable harm. The distinction mattered. She was not rejecting medicine, order, or chain of command. She was rejecting the use of those things as a shield against responsibility in the face of a deteriorating patient. That difference, once spoken aloud, altered the moral geometry of the room. The final shift came when Gabriel Cade stepped forward, reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, and placed a slim, weathered leather folder on the tray table beside Reed's bed. He did it with the quiet reluctance of a man who would have preferred not to reveal more than necessary in a civilian hospital room, yet no longer saw another path. He opened the folder and exposed laminated copies, citations, operational commendations, partial records, letters carrying seals and signatures, and an old photograph faded by sun and time. In the image, a younger Lena knelt in desert light beside a wounded soldier while two armed men guarded the perimeter. Even age and dust could not obscure the identities. Reed was there. Cade was there. And Lena, stripped of navy scrubs and fluorescent hallways, looked no less focused than she had in the trauma bay tonight. Cade spoke evenly, as if precision were the greatest mercy he could offer the room. He laid out the part of Lena's history that had never been printed in donor newsletters or staff bios. For 6 years, she had served as a combat medic and trauma specialist attached to joint recovery operations in conditions most civilian hospitals would not endure for 10 minutes. Her experience was documented, though parts remained classified. The call sign he had used earlier belonged to those years. Men had stayed alive long enough to get home because, when others panicked, Lena did not. He passed one document to the legal officer, then identified a specific event now famous in heavily edited public memory: Mason Reed's rescue in Al Anbar. The published version had omitted the medic who stabilized him after secondary blast injury and managed his airway through transport because she herself had requested anonymity. That unnamed medic had been Lena Hart. Silence followed, but it was not the same silence as before. It was no longer the tense hush of uncertainty. It was the silence of a room, being forced to recalculate what it had mistaken for ordinariness. Reed, watching Vale with a tired steadiness sharpened by survival, observed that the physician had mocked the one person in his trauma bay who had seen this exact physiology under conditions far worse than any civilian emergency department would ever simulate. Vale tried to cling to hospital protocol, insisting that even if the history were accurate, rules still applied. Lena did not argue with that. She never had. The issue was not whether protocols mattered. It was whether emergency necessity and clear clinical deterioration justified action when the attending had failed to reassess. Cade stated plainly that if the hospital wished to discuss crisis exception, failure to respond to warning signs, and liability exposure, that conversation could be had before the board. The legal officer, understanding the danger of continuing this exchange, informally at the bedside suggested relocation. Reed refused to help tidy it away. He had spent too much of his adult life watching institutions flatten good people, because those people did not fit the preferred silhouette of authority. Tonight, he had nearly become one more body in a story organized around appearances rather than action. He would not assist in burying the truth. Celia attempted to reclaim procedural ground by invoking due process. Reed answered that if the hospital wanted due process, then it should do it properly. The word properly carried weight because everyone in the room knew that what had nearly happened in the trauma bay had not been proper by any ethical measure that mattered. A meeting was arranged. Harbor Point, which had planned to manage this as a disciplinary problem involving a nurse, now had to prepare for a documented review involving testimony, timestamps, legal exposure, and a patient with influence who remained fully lucid and uncooperative with institutional convenience. By 3 in the morning, Administration Conference B was filled not with donors, communications specialists, or executive handlers, but with the people who had actually been present when the patient began to fail. The room itself was aggressively generic, as such rooms often are, designed to suggest neutrality while absorbing conflict. Priya Nair sat straight-backed and pale, her fatigue visible but her resolve firmer than anyone who underestimated her would have guessed. Malik Torres leaned against the wall with his arms folded, his expression unreadable in the way of men who have decided they are done dressing truth in polite packaging. The paramedic from the ambulance bay remained because someone had finally recognized that his memory of the sequence mattered. Rosa sat near Lena. Burton from Human Resources was there, along with the legal officer. Celia Morton, Adrian Vale, Commander Cade, and Colonel Mason Reed himself, in a wheelchair despite repeated objections that were part medical concern and part discomfort at his refusal to stay out of sight. Lena took the last chair and folded her hands in her lap. She did not sit like a defendant, though everyone knew she had been invited under that assumption. She sat as someone accustomed to surviving evaluation by remaining exact. The fluorescent lights flattened faces and sharpened fatigue. Files were opened, screens glowed awake, coffee cups appeared and went ignored. The review began with Vale, because men like him often do best in the first telling, before evidence enters to disturb the architecture of self-protection. He spoke smoothly and with enough elegance to make weakness sound like principle. He described dynamic trauma conditions, the necessity of controlled authority in emergency medicine, the dangers of fragmented command, and the risks posed by freelance intervention from staff operating outside designated responsibility. He used phrases like chain integrity and role confusion. He did not quite lie. That was what made him dangerous. He simply arranged selected truths in an order that flattered his judgment and concealed the cost of his dismissals. When Burton turned to Priya, the room shifted from narrative to sequence. He asked what Lena had said before the patient decompensated. Priya swallowed once and answered clearly. Lena had said that Reed's breath sounds were reduced on the left, that the pressure was falling, and that he needed immediate reassessment for tension pneumothorax. Burton asked when she had said it. Priya answered that it had been before the crash and more than once. He asked whether Vale had been present. She said yes. He asked how Vale had responded. Priya hesitated only long enough to steady herself against the consequences of speaking plainly. Then she stated that Vale had told Lena not to challenge him in front of the patient. The room absorbed the sentence in complete silence, because stripped of jargon it was what the night had been about. Status defending itself at the exact moment attention should have SH. Ifted to the bed. Malik did not decorate his testimony. He confirmed that Lena had been right and Vale had been wrong, and that the patient had moved toward catastrophe while the room waited for permission instead of reacting to clear signs. Celia attempted to discipline his tone, which only exposed how reflexively she still reached for control when facts turned against authority. Malik's look in return carried enough contempt to silence further correction. The paramedic confirmed the same sequence from a different vantage point. Rosa testified to Lena's charting and the timestamp. The legal officer projected trauma bay footage, chart entries, imaging, and event documentation. On the screen, once sequence replaced rhetoric, the timeline became merciless in its clarity. Warning, dismissal, deterioration, collapse, intervention, survival. There was no elegant way to narrate around it anymore. Video has a brutal gift for draining power from people who rely on tone to control memory. Vale saw it as plainly as everyone else did, but pride rarely exits through the nearest available door. He tried one last reframe, suggesting that the room was turning an extraordinary circumstance into a public execution because a nurse with a dramatic military background had decided to play hero. Lena, who had remained silent through the testimonies, finally lifted her eyes and answered in the simplest way possible. She had not wanted to play hero. She had wanted him to listen. Because there was no anger in her voice, the statement struck harder than any raised accusation would have. She explained that she had warned him while there was still time for him to act, while there was still a version of events in which he could have led the room well. He had been too busy defending his authority to use it. No one interrupted because everyone present could feel the truth of it settling beyond dispute. Vale made one more desperate reach for grounds on which he might still stand taller than her. He pointed to the fact that Lena had never publicly advertised her background when she was hired. There was accusation in the implication, as if modesty itself were deceit because it prevented others from assigning her a respectable category in advance. Lena answered with a sentence that cut more cleanly than anything else that night. She had not hidden her background. She had declined to market it. That distinction landed across the conference table like a blade laid down with deliberate gentleness. It exposed not only Vale's insecurity, but a wider institutional habit. Harbor Point had been perfectly willing to respect symbols of excellence once branded and displayed, but it had not yet learned to recognize excellence when it arrived in quiet form and asked only to work. The room changed for the last time when Burton closed his folder. He had spent much of the night trying to preserve procedure, but the accumulated evidence had pushed him past neutrality into responsibility. Based on testimony, documentation, and the recorded sequence, he said, the immediate concern was no longer Lena Hart's intervention. The concern was the attending physician's repeated dismissal of a clearly documented clinical warning in a high-risk patient, followed by attempts to characterize the successful intervention as misconduct. Celia tried to interrupt, invoking caution, institutional process, and the need not to overstate the matter. Burton cut her off with more firmness than anyone in the room had expected from him. Not this time, he said in effect. He then recommended that Adrian Vale be removed from supervisory duty effective immediately pending full board review. Cade added, almost gently, that this would be the wise course. Vale looked around the room then as if searching for one face that would still reflect back the version of himself he preferred. He found no refuge, not in Celia, who had begun to understand how exposed she was, not in Burton, who had decided that documentation mattered more than internal alliances, not in Priya or Malik, whom he had underestimated as supporting cast in his own professional theater, not even in Reed, whose expression held not triumph but deep disappointment. That look seemed to land hardest. Vale stood, called the situation absurd because he had no other dignified word left, and was answered by Reed with the devastating observation that what had truly been absurd was calling Lena just a nurse. Vale left. The door closed softly behind him, and the soft click somehow sounded louder than shouting. After that, the consequences moved with the unnatural speed institutions sometimes display, once they decide a person is no longer worth protecting. Celia Morton was formally reprimanded for retaliatory reassignment during active review and for attempting to restrict patient-requested access without sound clinical basis. Vale was placed on immediate leave pending disciplinary proceedings, before the board could complete final act. Ian, he resigned, preferring the controlled dignity of departure to the slower humiliation of recorded censure. Harbor Point administration announced reviews of escalation policy, interdisciplinary response authority, and documentation safeguards during emergency deterioration events. Committees formed. Language was polished. Memos circulated with phrases about lessons learned and systemic improvement. Yet everyone who had actually been there understood that policy changes, however necessary, were not the part the hospital would remember most. What people remembered was the morning. At 8:15, the news had spread across 3 floors that Colonel Mason Reed was being moved from observation to a private recovery suite. Staff lined the hall not by formal instruction, but by that subtle social gravity which gathers people when something meaningful is about to occur, and no one wants to admit they have come to witness it. Lena had not intended to be part of that scene. She was at the nurse's station signing a medication reconciliation sheet when Rosa touched her elbow and told her that she should walk with them. Lena resisted immediately. She did not want a spectacle. Rosa, who understood moments better than most administrators ever would, answered that perhaps the scene was not for Lena's benefit at all. Perhaps the scene needed her. There was truth in that, though Lena disliked it. After a pause long enough to count as reluctance, she set down the pen and stepped into the hall. The corridor was lined with staff from different units, some in scrubs, some in white coats, some carrying clipboards they no longer pretended to be reading. Shame showed openly on a few faces, curiosity on others, quiet admiration on more than Lena was comfortable receiving. Reed came through in a wheelchair with color returning to his face and the oxygen gone. Cade walked beside him. When they reached Lena, Reed tapped the arm of the chair and the orderly stopped. Then, despite the obvious pain in his ribs and the immediate instinct of everyone nearby to prevent it, Reed began to stand. Lena moved forward at once, telling him with practical urgency that he did not need to do that. But Reed had spent too much of his life inside structures that understood symbol. He did need to do it, not for ceremony, but because some truths required posture to carry them fully. Cade steadied the chair without interfering. Reed rose slowly, turned toward Lena, and straightened as much as his healing body allowed. Then Gabriel Cade, veteran of deserts and storms, stepped back and spoke Lena's old call sign with quiet certainty. The single word crossed the hallway more powerfully than any announcement could have. Lena's face changed only slightly, yet the small shift revealed how much the name had once meant and how much it had cost to lay it down. Reed raised his hand in a formal salute. The corridor fell into an almost reverent stillness. No one moved. No one broke the moment with nervous noise. Lena stared at him, stunned in a way that those around her had never seen. Then, after the smallest hesitation, she returned the salute with perfect and unadorned precision. Somewhere near the back, a nurse began to cry. Priya pressed a hand over her mouth. Malik looked down and smiled to himself like a man who had finally solved the equation everyone else was still staring at. The emotional weight of the moment did not come from military symbolism alone. It came from the sudden correction of perspective. The staff were watching respect catch up to truth. Reed lowered his hand first, and with the dry steadiness of a man who knew an audience had finally become teachable, observed for everyone present that the quiet ones were not necessarily harmless or minor. Sometimes they were simply the people who already knew what noise cost. Then he looked back at Lena and thanked her for bringing him home twice. The line carried the whole span between desert extraction and hospital recovery without needing explanation. Lena answered in kind, telling him in effect that he ought not put her in a position to do it a third time. Laughter moved through the corridor in a low ripple, not because the situation had become light, but because truth had finally loosened the room's grip on fear. What followed was not magical. Hospitals do not become just because one truth wins a room. They continue being hospitals, full of systems, habits, vulnerabilities, and the awkward aftermath of exposure. There were formal reviews, compliance follow-ups, and a flurry of carefully worded communications drafted by people who preferred conflict after it had been translated into policy language. There were awkward apologies cornered into existence in supply rooms and staff lounges. Some apologies were sincere, some were managerial. A formal commendation was prepared for Lena. She tried to refuse it on the grounds that she had done what should have been done. Rosa threatened, only half jockin'. G to pin it to her locker herself if necessary. Priya began listening harder during rounds, not because she had been incompetent before, but because the night had shown her what deference could cost when it dulled her willingness to insist. Malik told anyone willing to listen that he had known Lena was dangerous from the first time he watched her organize a crash cart in under 30 seconds. The surprise to most people was that Lena stayed. Many assumed she would leave as soon as she reasonably could, unwilling to remain in a building that had nearly punished her for keeping a patient alive. Leaving would have been understandable. There were moments, especially in the first week, when the thought tempted her with the clean simplicity of retreat. But departure would have allowed others to write the ending. It would have let the institution transform her into an anecdote rather than a climate change. Lena stayed because leaving would have confirmed the old pattern in which quiet competence absorbs injury and exits gracefully, while the structure remains fundamentally unchanged. She also stayed because, somewhere beneath the fatigue and reluctance, she knew that not every room should be abandoned simply because it was late in learning what mattered. Some places had to be made to live with the truth long enough for it to alter behavior. Her remaining did not suddenly make Harbor Point enlightened. Respect, once embarrassed into existence, still needed practice. There were staff who now overcorrected, treating Lena less like a colleague and more like a legend, which irritated her almost as much as the earlier dismissals. A few physicians became self-conscious around her, unsure whether to see her as a threat, an asset, or a rebuke. Younger nurses looked at her with a kind of sharpened attention that sometimes bordered on awe. Lena worked steadily against all of it by returning again and again to the ordinary rigor of patient care. She charted thoroughly. She checked lines. She corrected medication timing. She answered call lights. She covered shifts when needed. She taught when asked and occasionally when not asked. Bit by bit, the mythology that threatened to gather around her was forced to coexist with the plain fact that real excellence is often repetitive, unglamorous, and relentlessly practical. Weeks later, the hospital launched a small training initiative focused on emergency escalation and interdisciplinary trauma response. On paper, it had a formal administrative title carefully balanced between legal caution and public reassurance. On the floors, long before the official language took hold, staff began calling it the Heart Protocol. Lena hated the name immediately. She objected that medicine should not be branded around individuals when the point was to build better systems. Rosa kept using it with enough cheerful stubbornness to ensure the nickname survived. The program itself emerged from the very fault lines the crisis had revealed. It trained nurses, residents, techs, and attendings together in recognition of rapid deterioration, closed-loop communication, challenge escalation, and emergency exception thresholds. More importantly, it gave explicit structure to something that should never have needed novelty: the right and obligation of any clinician to force reevaluation when a patient was slipping. Lena participated in designing parts of it only after repeated persuasion, and only under the condition that the emphasis stay on practical response rather than heroic narrative. She did not want simulations to become theater. She wanted them to teach rooms how not to lose precious minutes to hierarchy. In workshop sessions, she remained the same person she had always been: precise, economical, allergic to performance. She was not a charismatic lecturer in the conventional sense. She did not pace dramatically or fill silences with slogans. Yet staff listened to her with unusual concentration because every instruction felt field-tested by consequence. When she spoke about the sound of a change in breathing, the visual lag between monitor and body, or the danger of waiting for certainty when physiology had already declared itself, the room could sense that these lessons had been paid for in places most of them had never seen. She never used war stories to make the point. She did not need to. Priya changed noticeably under that training environment. Before the night of Reed's collapse, she had been diligent, smart, and more deferential than she realized. Afterward, something in her posture sharpened. She still respected experience and title, but she no longer equated them automatically with correctness. Lena noticed the difference first in small things. Priya began articulating concerns sooner during rounds. She asked for reassessment without apology. She documented more confidently. She learned the difficult art of sounding calm while refusing to be dismissed. It was not that she became louder. She became more anchored. On one late shift, while reviewing a complicated post-op patient, Priya caught a subtle decline in mentation and urine output that others had attributed to fatigue. She pushed early, labs were drawn, and sepsis was caught before the patient spiraled. She said little about it afterward. Lena noticed anyway. This, more than commendations or hallway salutes, was the kind of after-effect that mattered. Malik changed too, though in a different register. He had always been blunt, competent, and skeptical of performative authority. What shifted after the incident was not his instinct, but his willingness to invest more openly in the people around him. Before, he had treated the hospital's politics as weather: annoying, unavoidable, unworthy of emotional expenditure. After seeing how close the institution had come to sacrificing Lena to preserve a physician's ego, he became more deliberate about backing colleagues when the stakes were real. He covered for newer nurses when he sensed they were being steamrolled in rounds. He corrected residents with a dryness that somehow stung less now that everyone knew he was usually right. He also developed a fondness for telling the story of Lena's crash cart efficiency to anyone who mistook her calm for softness. Under the roughness, the story served as his way of guarding a standard he now believed the building might actually learn to deserve. As for Rosa, she had long been the kind of nurse who functioned as institutional memory without needing title to authorize it. The incident with Reed simply made visible what she had already known. Hospitals survive not on org charts alone, but on the quiet network of people who notice, remember, warn, and refuse to let the wrong version of events harden into policy. Rosa took considerable pleasure in watching administration slowly catch up to truths the nursing staff had recognized in a single night. She also made a private mission of ensuring Lena never dissolved back into invisibility in the harmful sense. She was careful not to romanticize her, but equally careful not to let the hospital return to convenient amnesia. If an attending dismissed a concern too quickly during training, Rosa had a way of invoking the incident without naming it directly, and the room invariably recalibrated. Celia Morton endured her reprimand badly, not because the sanction itself was career-ending, but because it forced her to confront an image of herself she had spent years avoiding. She had always told herself that she protected order, stability, and institutional function. In quieter moments after the review, she could no longer entirely escape the truth that on the night Reed deteriorated, she had protected hierarchy first. It unsettled her to realize how easily the language of due process and professional boundaries could become a polished instrument for suppressing inconvenient competence. Celia did not transform overnight into a different person. Real change seldom offers that kind of theatrical redemption. But she became more cautious in how she wielded authority. She listened longer before deciding whose version of a conflict would define the administrative response. In some rooms, this looked like wisdom. In others, it looked like fear. Perhaps it was both. Harbor Point itself adapted in layers. The official culture shifted first in language. New policies emphasized interdisciplinary escalation, documentation integrity, and non-retaliatory review pathways. Posters appeared in staff areas reminding clinicians that patient safety outranked status. Such signage, by itself, changed nothing. What mattered more was the gradual behavioral shift among those who had watched the old assumptions fail. Attendings became marginally more careful about dismissing bedside concerns in public. Charge nurses began building more explicit challenge ladders into handoffs. Simulations incorporated scenarios where the correct answer came from the least prestigious person in the room. A few senior physicians grumbled that medicine was becoming overly procedural in reaction to one bad night. But even they learned to moderate the complaint, because nobody wanted to be the next cautionary example attached to a case that already circulated far beyond the hospital's walls. The public story of the event remained controlled. Harbor Point issued statements about a high-profile patient's successful stabilization and subsequent internal improvements. Reed, whose name carried enough weight to ignite media attention if he chose, declined to turn the matter into spectacle. That restraint mattered. He understood the difference between demanding accountability and feeding a public appetite for scandal. He had no interest in burning the place down if it could still be forced to learn. But within the hospital and among certain professional circles, the story traveled in fuller form, not as gossip exactly, but as a caution and a standard. It became the kind of narrati that reshapes rooms before anyone formally cites it. Somewhere in emergency departments, conference rooms, and quiet break spaces, people began invoking Harbor Point as shorthand for what happens when authority mistakes itself for competence. For Lena, the weeks after the incident carried an unusual tension. She was more visible than she had been in years, and visibility had never been something she trusted. Her time in military medicine had taught her that attention was often merely the bright edge of future expectation. Heroism, once assigned, could become a trap. It simplified what had been ugly, complex, and costly. She had spent years constructing a life in which her value did not depend on the room knowing where she had served or who owed her their survival. Harbor Point had torn that privacy open. Even though the revelation had protected her, it also left her feeling faintly exposed, as if the wall between past and present had been breached by necessity and might not close again cleanly. She found herself waking more lightly, listening to helicopters differently, measuring unfamiliar footsteps in hallways with instincts she had long ago taught herself to mute. Yet the same exposure brought something else, something harder to name and harder still to dismiss. For the first time in a very long while, she was not carrying the whole weight of her competence alone. The hospital had seen enough to stop treating her calm as emptiness. Colleagues now trusted her in ways that were sometimes uncomfortable but often earned. There was relief in that, even if she resisted romantic language around it. She no longer had to choose every day between invisibility and explanation. She could simply work and be believed. That was not a small thing. People who have long been underestimated know how exhausting it is to perform certainty at a volume others will accept. The removal of that burden, even partially, can feel like recovering oxygen after years of shallow breathing. Mason Reed remained at Harbor Point in a private recovery suite longer than his public itinerary had planned. Officially, this was because of observation needs related to the chest injury. Unofficially, it also gave him time to ensure that the institution's corrective momentum did not evaporate once the immediate embarrassment passed. He met with administrators, legal advisors, and clinical leadership in ways that were polite on the surface and unyielding underneath. He did not posture. He did not threaten unless pressed. but he made it unmistakably clear that any attempt to reframe the incident into an unfortunate misunderstanding involving an overzealous nurse would meet resistance backed by memory, documentation, and influence. He also asked to see Lena more than once during recovery. Their conversations, when they happened, were brief, practical, and layered with all the years they did not unpack. Neither seemed interested in dramatizing the past. Both seemed to understand that some bonds survive precisely because they are not overexplained. Gabriel Cade came and went like weather with a schedule. He was rarely in the building for long stretches, yet every appearance altered the emotional temperature around whatever room he entered. Unlike Reed, who could still move through public admiration with something like ease, Cade wore history more privately. He did not volunteer stories. He did not correct every misconception. But when Lena passed him in corridors or near elevators, there was a flicker of recognition between them that belonged to another life. Their exchanges were sparse, often edged with old dry humor and laden with the unspoken knowledge of what each had once seen the other survive. Cade seemed to understand better than anyone at Harbor Point that Lena's preference for quiet was not modesty in the decorative sense. It was a structure built from necessity. He honored it even while having been the one to tear part of it open at the bedside. One evening, after the first week of the new training initiative, Priya found Lena washing her hands before evening rounds and asked a question that had probably lived in many minds without finding a safe path to speech. She wondered whether Lena ever wished people had known from the beginning who she had been before Harbor Point. It was the kind of question that could easily have become sentimental in another room. At the sink with soap rinsing away and fluorescent light reflecting off stainless steel, it remained plain. Lena considered it longer than Priya expected. Then she answered that she did not wish that. If people had respected her only because of where she had been, they would never have learned to respect the work in front of them. The sentence stayed with Priya. It contained a standard far more difficult than admiration for medals or history. It required people to see value where no prestige label had been attached for them in advance. That answer also explained something essential about Lena's whole way of moving through the world. In the years after she left military service, she had not hidden because she was ashamed of what she had done, nor had she concealed her history to create drama later. She had stepped away from the performance of biography because she knew how easily institutions substitute symbols for actual attention. A decorated background can buy instant deference, but it can also let people stop listening to the work itself. She had wanted, perhaps stubbornly, a life in which her competence had to stand on present action rather than inherited aura. Harbor Point had failed that test at first, but once forced into correction, it had at least begun to understand the principle. Respect that arrives only after a resume glitters is not respect for the person in front of you. It is respect for what flatters your imagination about them. This was the lesson that spread most deeply through the staff, though few could have phrased it so neatly. More nurses began noticing how often they themselves had internalized the same habits that had nearly gotten Reed killed. The pause before speaking up, the instinct to soften warning into suggestion, the tendency to assume that confidence indicated accuracy. Residents, particularly the younger ones, watched the aftermath with an anxious fascination because it exposed vulnerabilities in a training culture that often rewarded certainty more visibly than humility. Some of the best among them learned quickly. They asked better questions. They listened to bedside nurses with less performative patience and more actual respect. A handful of senior attendings, to their credit, volunteered to participate in debriefs about hierarchy and cognitive lock-in. These sessions were uncomfortable. They were also useful. Medicine, like any field practiced under pressure, prefers to imagine that errors arise from lack of knowledge rather than distorted human dynamics. Harbor Point could no longer fully afford that illusion. In private moments, Lena still paid the quieter costs of the night. She had not invited the return of old memories, yet crisis had a way of reopening buried pathways. Certain tones of monitor alarm now carried desert echoes. The smell of antiseptic mixed with rain pulled strange fragments loose from long-sealed compartments in her mind. She would catch herself tracking exits in patient rooms, clocking the weight of someone's footsteps, or calculating blood loss and airway compromise with the instant, cold clarity that had once governed every waking hour. None of this visibly impaired her work. If anything, it made her sharper. But the return of those reflexes reminded her that the self she had tried to fold away was never really gone. It had only been waiting for necessity to call it back into the room. There was grief in that recognition and comfort, too. Some names leave the mouth, very few leave the bones. Rosa, who saw more than she said, recognized the strain without forcing it into conversation. She covered one of Lena's shifts under the pretense of a scheduling need. She left a cup of fresh coffee where the old cold ones tended to gather. She also developed the habit of redirecting staff who approached Lena for dramatic retellings of the incident, especially when those requests carried the hungry curiosity of people attracted to heroism but uninterested in its weight. In Rose's view, if the staff wished to honor what Lena had done, they could start by learning the escalation protocols and listening properly on the next difficult night. Everything else was vanity, because Rosa occupied that rare moral position held by experienced nurses who no longer require anyone's approval. People generally listened. Harbor Point's informal culture often improved more under Rosa's eyebrows than under executive memos. Reed was eventually discharged with instructions, follow-up schedules, and a level of scrutiny that attached naturally to patients whose names moved through national circles. Before leaving, he requested a final private visit with Lena. It took place late enough in the day that the unit had quieted. No witnesses lined the hall this time. No symbolic gestures were necessary. He thanked her again, not in the ceremonial way of the morning salute, but in the more difficult way of one adult acknowledging a debt that cannot be fully repaid because it involves continued existence. He also admitted that seeing her here, under fluorescent lights and civilian charts after all those years, had unsettled him in a way he had not expected. Part of him had believed that figures from that life existed only in the sealed chambers of memory. Lena answered with a steadiness that suggested she had felt the same shock. Then they let the conversation rest where it needed to. Some relationships are held together not by constant contact, but by the certainty that when the line reappears, it still means what it once did. After Reed left, the hospital led into a new version of itself, not a perfected one, but a chastened one. The gala banners were eventually taken down. The atrium returned to its polished daily neutrality. New crises came as they always do. Children spiked fevers, post-op patients crashed, families argued in waiting rooms, staff called in sick, weather delayed transfers. Harbor Point continued being a place where life and error, skill and limitation, exhaustion and grace lived too close together for anyone to maintain simple illusions for long. In that ongoing turbulence, the Reed incident became less a single event and more a fault line that had taught people where the building cracked under pressure. Knowing that did not prevent future strain. It did, however, give some of them better instincts about where to stand when the next wall shook. The new escalation training produced its own stories. During one simulation, a junior respiratory therapist challenged an attending's assumption about a patient's decompensation and was correct. Instead of resentment, the attending thanked her in front of the room. The acknowledgement was small and to anyone outside the hospital unremarkable. Inside Harbor Point, it marked progress. On another shift, a resident who had once been visibly defensive when corrected by nurses halted a deteriorating septic cascade because he heard a charge nurse's concern as data rather than annoyance. No one called these moments revolutionary, yet they formed the practical evidence that culture does not change through declarations alone. It changes when people under pressure choose different reflexes than they would have chosen before. Lena watched these developments with cautious satisfaction and resisted the temptation to trust them too quickly. She knew too well that institutions can learn vocabulary faster than they learn character. Still, the work in front of her had undeniably improved. There were also failures. Not every room listened well simply because Harbor Point had been embarrassed once. Old habits resurfaced under fatigue. Some physicians still bristled when challenged, especially in front of families or peers. A few nurses, newly empowered by policy language, confused escalation with theater and had to learn the difference between clear intervention and ego in another uniform. Lena addressed these cases firmly. The point was not to invert hierarchy into chaos. The point was to anchor authority back to patient need instead of personal status. She reminded trainees that the goal in crisis is not to win the room. It is to keep the patient alive. If being right becomes a performance, even righteous performance, the room can still lose the person in the bed. That lesson, perhaps more than any tactical checklist, marked the difference between professionals who merely know the script of safety and those who understand its moral center. In quieter hours, when rain struck the windows again and hallways took on the late-night hush that had framed the beginning of the ordeal, Lena sometimes returned in memory to the corridor outside the old rehabilitation wing where she had sat with cold coffee and unfinished charts, while the hospital weighed whether to thank her or punish her. The image stayed with her because it contained the entire tension of the life she had chosen. There is a particular loneliness to being the person who acts from necessity before the room has decided it will permit you to be correct. That loneliness had followed her from battlefields to civilian wards, changing costume but not structure. Yet now, when she revisited that moment, another image inevitably followed it. Reed standing painfully in the hall, Cade speaking the old call sign, the staff witnessing a truth they had not known how to recognize until it was named. The second image did not erase the first, it gave it company. Over time, the staff stopped speaking of the incident with the breathless intensity of recent scandal and began using it as reference instead. Someone would say, in the middle of a difficult case, that they were not going to repeat Harbor Point. Another would answer that they wanted a reassessment now, not after the patient crashed. It became a shorthand for vigilance against the seduction of rank. Lena disliked the nickname and the mythology both, but she could not deny the utility of a shared cautionary language. Stories shape institutions whether leadership acknowledges it or not. Better, perhaps, that this one remind people of the cost of delay than dissolve into a polished anecdote about hidden heroism. For Lena, the hero framing was always the least interesting part. What mattered was that a patient had lived because someone refused to confuse professional silence with professional virtue. Months later, when the training initiative received a modest regional recognition for improving interdisciplinary response practices, an administrator asked whether Lena would be willing to stand for a photograph near the P. She nearly laughed. Rosa, who was present, answered for her by saying that if the hospital wanted to honor Lena, it could do so by funding additional nurse education slots and preserving protected training time during budget season. The administrator looked mildly stunned. The funding request, to everyone's surprise, was later approved. Rosa pretended not to be pleased. Lena pretended not to notice that Rosa had once again turned principle into material change. It was, Lena thought, another version of the same lesson. Real respect is measured in what systems support, not just in what halls applaud. As seasons shifted, Reed occasionally sent brief messages through channels quiet enough to avoid fanfare. Nothing dramatic, notes about recovery progress, a clipped thanks on the anniversary of the night. Once, a newspaper clipping about a policy reform in another hospital system that had cited interdisciplinary escalation research. Lena never answered at length. Neither of them needed the comfort of continuous contact. The thread between them had already survived more than absence. Cade appeared even less often, though on one rare visit he paused near the nurse's station, glanced at the training materials pinned to a board, and remarked with dry approval that the place seemed to be learning not to mistake volume for competence. Lena answered that the jury remained out. He said that in his experience, skepticism was often the healthiest form of hope. Then he left before anyone else could gather enough courage to approach him. There were nights when the emergency department grew so loud and bright that the whole building seemed to vibrate with urgency. On those nights, Lena moved through rooms with the same grounded economy that had once made men give her a call sign under desert sun. Newer staff often watched her in those moments and mistook her calm for an absence of fear. It was not that. She knew fear intimately. She simply knew that fear becomes useful only when disciplined into action. Harbor Point had finally begun to learn this too. Not from lectures, not from posters, but from watching one person refuse to let avoidable harm pass unchallenged. The lesson remained fragile, as all institutional lessons do, but it had taken root in enough people to matter. When someone soft-spoken at the bedside now said they were worried, more heads turned before it was too late. If there was any enduring meaning in what happened at Harbor Point, it did not lie in the romance of hidden greatness suddenly revealed. It lay in something simpler and more difficult. Competence rarely announces itself with the volume most systems are trained to reward. Dignity does not always decorate itself in language power can recognize quickly. The person most worth listening to in a critical room may be the least interested in winning that room's approval. That truth had always existed. Harbor Point had merely been forced, through pain and near loss, to acknowledge it. Lena understood this better than anyone because she had built her entire adult life around doing the work, whether or not the room understood what stood before it. The night Reed nearly died had not turned her into anything new. It had only stripped away enough illusion for others to see, briefly and unmistakably, what had already been there. And so the hospital carried on. Charts accumulated. Shift change came and went. Helicopters crossed the sky over the city and still made Lena glance instinctively toward the window before returning to the patient in front of her. Some habits never leave. Some names remain folded inside the self even when no one speaks them aloud for years. Some people spend whole chapters of their lives being underestimated because the world has confused quiet with ordinary. Harbor Point learned at cost that this confusion can be dangerous. It also learned that repair is possible, though never complete, when truth is finally allowed into the room and enough people refuse to look away. Lena Hart remained what she had always insisted she was, a nurse. She was also a trauma specialist shaped by places most of her colleagues would never see, a woman who had once knelt in sand with blood on her gloves and later sat in fluorescent corridors with cold coffee and unfinished charts while institutions considered whether skill without sanctioned prestige should be punished. Both things were true. Neither canceled the other. What changed after Harbor Point was not Lena's essence, but the building's ability to recognize that the title nurse had never meant lesser. It had meant the person at the bedside, the person charting precisely, the person noticing first, the person willing to speak while there was still time, and when necessary, the person willing to act after being ignored. In the end, that was what the hospital remembered, whether in official policy or whispered staff folklore. Not the gala banners, not the legal maneuvers, not even Vale's collapse. From certainty into resignation, what endured was the image of a room finally understanding the difference between importance and performance. A doctor had needed witnesses to confirm his standing. A nurse had needed the patient to keep breathing. When the test came, only one priority proved worthy of respect. Everything else was theater falling apart under better light.